that he does independently. So without further ado and without wasting any more time, let's hand over to Andy, who's going to talk to us about peer observation and how we make it work. Thank you, Andy. Over to you.
Thank you, Lorraine. First, before we start, I'd like to kind of just give you a slight warning to everybody. Where I live, we're currently in the middle of lots of very powerful thunderstorms, and my internet was off all morning. And there is a small possibility that either my internet or my electricity, which will also mean my internet, will go off in the next hour. So I hope that doesn't happen, but just to warn you in advance, if I suddenly seem to go off, that's probably why. But hopefully it'll all go well. If you have any questions that come to you while you're listening to the webinar, please note them down in the chat window to the right. Most of you have already found that, I can see. So please note down any questions you have in the right-hand chat window, and I'll hopefully either during the webinar or afterwards, I'll get to your questions. Is everyone's sound okay? I'm getting a slight bit of feedback, but I hope it's okay. Okay, so anyway, the idea behind this particular webinar is to do with peer observation. I think we're all familiar with the concept of what peer observation is, i.e. teachers observing teachers as peers. But I'm interested by how peer observation works and how it doesn't work. So this is basically what we're going to talk about. First, I'm going to ask you a question, which will be a little poll for this group. We'll talk about people's experiences with peer observation, why I think peer observation is a good thing, and I hope that you'll agree with me. What are the reasons why peer observation doesn't always work? How can we overcome those obstacles? What some ideas for dealing with those obstacles and some of the problems that we experience with peer observation systems, and some suggestions. And then I'm going to give you one specific idea which has come to me as my role as the lead trainer on the International Diploma in Language Teaching Management, or the IDLTIM as it's sometimes called. But there are obviously different ways, and these ideas are context specific. And finally, I'd like you to think about what you want to take away from this particular webinar. Okay, so without further ado, a question for you, and I'm gonna, I hope, open up now a poll which you can see. I believe that poll is now visible. So, do people at your school or whatever your organization, your language teaching organization is, do those people do peer observation? And is it a mandatory thing? Is it encouraged by the management? Or is it completely informal that teachers do it by just talking to each other and deciding to do so? So I'll give you a minute or so to record your ideas there. Okay, so we've got 10, 16. Hopefully that you can see I hope you can see the results there. So we've got, I think, 17 people have responded. 7, which is about 40% of you, have said that people don't do peer observation. The next highest is a few do it on an informal basis. So of the 17 of us, 12 people really have no system. Some people do it informally, and then there are 5 of you who actually have a system, either a mandatory system or an encouraged system. Okay, so thanks for that. Thanks for answering that question. To move on. So why did I become interested in this question? Well, one reason is because I think that peer observation is a great idea, and a lot of people seem to believe in it, but for some reason it didn't always get off the ground very well. So most of the people I work with are managers, language school managers, and it seemed that they were mostly enthusiastic about peer observation. It's clearly a good idea. And they either wrote it into people's contracts, or they created a system, or they had something that they thought would be a good idea for peer observation. But quite often it either fell by the wayside, people didn't do it, or people didn't spend much time on it, or people saw it as a chore or something that had to be done as oh, it's one of these things I have to do. And so I wondered why this was, and I wondered if there was, something that could be done about this, that could make peer observation more successful. So I did some research among people I know, people I'm connected to, and to find out some of the answers to these questions. The first two are basically the questions you've just answered. Do you have a peer observation system at your school? Is it compulsory, optional, or isn't there one? How successful is it? What's its purpose, and is its purpose clear to people? Do people actually do it? Do they do peer observation? Do they develop through doing peer observation? And I asked about the systems that people did, and I got quite a lot of answers to those questions, which was a very interesting. It gave me some interesting data. So some of the things I learned: 27% of schools that I really it wasn't mandatory, it wasn't obligatory, and 35% had no system. In answer to the question, does it work? And I defined does it work by teachers participate enthusiastically and gain a lot, or at least they feel like they gain a lot. And you can see the results there, that 13% said very much so, 50% said, yeah, some teachers gain, some teachers not so much. 9% perceived it as just an obligation, that was something we have to do. And obviously 34% didn't ever do it, so that was slightly different. Different response there. So other findings that I found from this survey, the systems that existed that people talked about were basically driven. So those schools that had a system, this is to say, were driven by the DOS or their academic manager or whoever it was. So someone in let's say a management role had set up the system and said, you must do this. Before the observations, sometimes there was a requirement for teachers to meet, i.e. the observed teacher and the observer would meet before the thing and talk about the lesson. Sometimes there were forms that had to be filled in as part of that process, and sometimes there was nothing. There was no requirement to talk before the lesson. The observer simply went to the lesson. It had to be agreed when they would go, but they wouldn't necessarily discuss the lesson beforehand. During the observation, some schools offered tasks for the observers to do. These are the things that you are looking for. Maybe a checklist, maybe some kind of form to fill in. Sometimes the observation tasks or what was being observed for was negotiated between observer and observed teacher. So, for example, if the observed teacher said, "I'd like you to give me some feedback on the way I correct errors," for example, so that the observer knew specifically what things to focus on. And after the observation, quite often there was a discussion, but not always, to my surprise. And in some cases there were forms to be filled in, because in some cases this was an obligation, and therefore there had to be a record that the thing had taken place, so that the people would know, okay, it's happened. So those are some of the things I found. So this is my feelings about the benefits of peer observation. You may have others, and you're welcome to add them to the list, either in the chat window or sort of in your head, if you like. Some of the reasons that I think peer observation is a great idea. I think observing someone is a very good source of professional development. Observing someone else teach is extremely useful. You get to see how another person approaches a certain topic or a certain area of teaching. how they deal with the learners, how they interact with people, how they give instructions. There's so many things, classroom management, all of those things that you can see another teacher do, which we rarely get the chance to do. We rarely get the chance to actually watch other teachers teach. And I think it can be a very great source of professional development. It's also a great source of professional development for the teacher being observed, as long as afterwards you get feedback from the observer and you have a reasonably good relationship, and you can see what the observer thought of it and say, the observer might say, well, I would have done it like this, and you can compare that, the way that you might do these things. So I think it's a great source of professional development. In my opinion, if you like, this is a non-top-down thing. It's peer-to-peer. It's not about someone from above saying, you do this, you do this. It's about two peers coming together and sharing ideas and learning from one another. And I think that that's one of its benefits, and that's one of the things that needs to be retained in a successful peer observation system. And the schools that I talked to, the people I talked to, had a system which was very much top down. You must do this. You must observe her. That kind of thing. It didn't really work. It became this this obligation, and not really something that people felt like it was a learning process. One of the things I talk about when I'm teaching managers is the idea of this culture of feedback. The idea that feedback is a great tool for learning, a great tool for developing, and it's a great tool for organizations in general to be communication hubs where people are actually talking and working together. And I think that having a good peer observation system actually gives people that practice in giving feedback and receiving feedback, because those things are skills. And I think peer observation can create the conditions for a greater culture of feedback in the organization as a whole. I would say a successful peer observation is perceived as developmental, i.e. it's perceived as professional development, not as an evaluative tool, as a judgmental thing. I mean, this sounds like an odd thing to say, but as a source of professional development, peer observation is cheap. And this may sound a bit sound a bit money oriented, but sending people to a conference, sending people, having training courses, sending someone to do a long-term training course, for example, as we know, costs money. Whereas peer observation is a much cheaper form of professional development, which is not to say that we should ignore all the other forms of professional development. I absolutely don't think that, but it is something that you can do without really hitting the budget too badly. Okay, so why doesn't it work better? Why is peer observation not quite as successful as it should be? Well, in my experience, talking to various people and sort of seeing in different schools, one of the reasons sometimes it's seen as imposed. The manager, the director of studies, has decided peer observation is a great thing for the reasons we've just said, for good reasons, but they've kind of imposed it on teachers and said, peer observation is great. Here's your chance to do this, and you must observe 2 people a year, or whatever the contractual obligation has become, could be seen as imposed. So that's one reason why it doesn't really work, because people don't tend to like doing things which they feel as imposed, and they haven't really had a say in it. It's seen as not important. Maybe the school has a system, but they don't really make it clear that it's an important idea. And so this is a problem. If the school doesn't really make it clear that this is an important thing, that causes problems with it. People don't have the time. I mean, this is in many ways one of the greatest obstacles to it, because you're asking people who are full-time doing lots and lots of work to do something else and maybe observe someone, and maybe the person they want to observe is teaching at the same time as them anyway, so they can't observe the actual teacher they'd like to observe. They feel that the one that they feel they maybe could learn the most from. So time is obviously a major issue. maybe there is time, or maybe time is given, like, okay, well, it's our part of our system, therefore you are given this hour, this period of time to do the peer observation, but it's not enough time to do it properly. Maybe there's the hour written into the contract of the lesson, but not the extra time for giving the feedback and so on. People don't know how to observe. I mean, it sounds like a strange thing, but it's a skill, sitting in a lesson and watching. And some people don't know what to do, so they need some support and help in making sure, giving them some practice and some training in what to do while you're observing. How would you observe? People don't know how to give feedback. This is a major problem in general. I think people don't know how to give feedback, and people don't know how to receive feedback. And these are two skills which I think are very important too. And I think that those of you who do observations and do give feedback afterwards, you know full well that giving feedback is a skill, and it's quite delicate. And receiving feedback is also a skill. So those skills kind of get in the way. And people are scared. People are scared of being observed. People are scared that someone's going to come into their lesson and see that they're doing it wrong, which is obviously not the point of observations. But many of our previous experiences with observation can maybe lead us to this point that observation is about evaluating us. If you did a CELTA or similar kind of qualification before you came into teaching, or whether you did it in university or wherever you learned your teaching, probably observation was a part of it, and those feedback sessions afterwards felt very evaluative. And then maybe you have an annual performance review with your manager, who's also evaluating you through this feedback session. And therefore, feedback is perceived as an evaluative tool, and people get scared of it. And one other thing is that because some schools have a system where there's an expectation that, or an even obligation, that you do a certain number of peer observations over the course of a term or a semester or a year, they tend to require that there is some kind of proof, that the observation happened. Now, if that proof, for example, is the observation notes from the observer, and that has to go into the file somewhere, then immediately that observation is no longer something between two people. Even if no one's ever going to read those notes, they just want the notes to prove that something happened. That is not how it's perceived. The people will, okay, this is between us two, but because these notes are going somewhere else to a file in the manager's office, then it's no longer just a peer thing. So that's an obstacle to successful peer observation. So how would you overcome some of these obstacles? I can see that you've already been chatting about that, but just take a moment. How would you think about overcoming some of these things? How can you make it not seem imposed, not seen as unimportant? So for a minute or two, just think about that, and if you want, put your thoughts in the chat window, but if you prefer, just think, and then we'll come up with I'll present some ideas in a second. Thanks. There's some great ideas coming up in the chat window, and I think I'll cover most of these ideas in the next section. But it's great to see that we're all thinking on the same lines, I think. So thank you for that, and feel free to keep adding things to that chat window. There's some great ideas there, and please follow it yourselves as well. So here's the ideas that I came up with, some thoughts I had about overcoming these obstacles, and we'll see how it goes. So some ideas: make it bottom up, which is to see, like, as a director of studies, as an academic manager, think about, you can sell peer observation to the teachers. You can talk about peer observation and make teachers realize how valuable it is in case they don't already know. I mean, I suspect most teachers would probably quickly understand the value of peer observation. But have teachers be the ones who define how it works. So I think that's an important way of overcoming the obstacles, making the teachers kind of in charge of it, in charge of the system. It's their system, it's for their benefit. So don't tell them how to do it. Give them the opportunity to make it work. Bear in mind it's important. We've decided we think it's important. I mean, I've decided I think it's important, but I hope you're agreeing with me. So make sure time is given. Make sure people have the time to do it. If you're adding this to people's workload, they perceive it as an extra imposition and therefore not really something that they can easily do. So make it part of contractual time for those teachers who are on contract in that sort of on a full-time contract, so that they can see that there is this period of time in their contract which is part of their professional development or peer observation contract, if you like. And if they are not on contract, if they're on part-time, I noticed a number of the questions have been about part-time teachers or teachers who are sort of like on a different kind of contract, at least. Then contract them to do some peer observation. I mean, there's a cost here. I said earlier that it was cheap, and obviously once you start paying part-time staff to spend an hour doing a peer observation, or an hour and a half because you want the piece afterwards, there is a cost to it. And I think when I said it was cheap, I don't mean it's free. It's not free, but it's cheaper than many other forms of professional development, I think. So pay people, and if it's not, if you're talking about a school that has 50 teachers who are on this kind of part-time contract, then it is going to be a fair amount of money. But most schools, we're not talking about that number of people, and you would schedule it, let's say, once a semester or something like that, which would give it, but make it part of people's time so that people know how it's important. What evidence do you need? Do you need any evidence that it's taken place? We've talked about, evidence, but what kind of evidence do you need? Is it possible? Is it just possible that you could trust the teachers to do this without actually having evidence? That's kind of something that you have to decide if you're a director of studies or a manager. But I think it's something that, I mean, there's a famous quote by one of my favorite management writers, who's a guy called Ricardo Semler, a Brazilian. And he says one of the things that we do as managers is we go through this recruitment process and we look for adults. We're hiring an adult. And the moment we hire them, we turn them into children. We treat them like children. Possibly you can actually trust your teachers to do this without having some kind of proof. If, however, you're in a situation where you feel like there needs to be proof, where you have someone above you who's saying, well, how do we know the teachers did this? Then come up with some form of evidence that it happened that doesn't necessarily involve sharing the observation between the two teachers. Just some kind of record has taken place. There's a tick in a box by two teachers, or whatever it happens to be. But ideally, clearly, you just trust the teachers. Support people. Support the teachers in doing this. Give them some training and observation. It's not necessarily something we all can do. Give people training. Suggest possible tasks, or ask them to come up with possible tasks. What can the observer do? offer training and giving and receiving feedback. This is for me, this is a crucial thing to do. I think it's very important to give people training in this. The feedback is a very difficult thing to do, and we don't often give training in giving and receiving feedback. In fact, I think this is a problem throughout, and even something like, when I was for a while a CELTA trainer, and we didn't get training in giving or receiving feedback. We shadowed, we watched people doing it, we talked about it with people we were shadowing, but we didn't actually get any training in it, and I think it's an important skill. Okay, so I'm going to share with you one solution that I have heard. This may not work in your context, but hopefully, as you listen to it, as you hear this idea that this manager came up with, it will spark some ideas for you, which may help you to come up with a system or a way of coming up with a system that works in your context. So this was a student a student who was working with me. As I said, I teach this International Diploma in Language Teaching Management course, a number of the students of which I noticed are here. This was a student in Australia, in Melbourne, called Pip. And he, as one of his assignments, his managing teacher's assignment, developed a peer observation system, or developed a way of bringing up a peer observation system. And I'll go through it. So it was a difficult situation. His school had, there'd been some history, let's say. There were historical problems between teachers and management. And he had recently moved into a management role and felt this very strongly and felt this very sharply. And he felt that teachers were quite resistant, both to anything management suggested and observation as a whole, for many reasons. The performance review system had not necessarily worked very well, and so on. So there was a lot of resistance. So his solution was this thing called the peer support model, which is based on the work of Jill Koch. At the end of the talk, I'll give you the references for this. And I'm also going to share with you 2 articles that I've written, one which was in the LAMSIG, ITEF or LAMSIG newsletter, which I wrote a couple of years ago, and then one where I developed that article quite significantly recently for the Spelt journal in Pakistan. So those 2 articles will be shared, and I'll give you the link at the end of the session. So anyway, so he used this peer support model, and I'll explain what that is in a second. So peer support, the idea is that the traditional dynamic of the observation, in the traditional way that we perceive observation, the expert is the observer. In the CELTA trainer is the observer. In the performance review system, let's call it your performance management system of your school, the director of studies observes the teacher to evaluate them. Again, there's always this perception that the observer is the expert. The peer support model on Jill Koch's work is the other way around. That the idea is that the observer is the learner in this process, and the teacher is the expert. So that flips the traditional dynamic. It makes the observation significantly less stressful for the teacher, because it's not about the other person judging them as an expert. It's about them being the expert. So I'll explain how that worked in his context in a minute, but that's the model. So he called a meeting of the teachers, and what he did was he gave everybody an article. It was the photocopied page from the appendices of Jeremy Harmer's Practice of English Teaching, of English Language Teaching, which talks about peer observation. So in Jeremy's book, there is a piece, like a 1 or 2 page piece, which talks about peer observation, which is a very nice, gentle introduction to the idea of peer observation. So he photocopied that, gave it to all the teachers, and said, called a meeting and to talk about peer observation. And he knew that the first reaction that many of the teachers would be is, oh no, we're going to do something else, it's going to be more work, etc., etc., etc. And But he gave them a few days between these two things. So before the meeting, they had, let's say a week to look at this article and chat. And actually, he started to hear and kind of like pick up that people were not necessarily opposed to the idea. They didn't want to be told they were going to do lots of extra work, but they were reading this article and had actually paid attention to it and thought, oh, actually, it's not a bad idea. So he proposed the idea during the meeting that the teachers would have a peer observation system, but he asked the teachers to work out the details. And the teachers formed a group of people who investigated, they did some research, they read some books, they looked into what would be the best way to do peer observation. And they're the ones who came up with this peer support model, this Jill-Kosh model. So their procedure for their peer observation system was the following. The teachers who would think about on their own, what is it that they wanted to learn? What was the teaching practice that they were interested in developing? Could it be something like, it could be classroom management issues to do with giving instructions or error correction or what have you. It could be to do with teaching particular skills. I'd like to be a bit better at I'd like to develop my skills in teaching extensive reading, that kind of thing. It could have been sort of specifically about things like grammar or vocabulary, presentations and so on. So they worked out what it was of their teaching practice that they were interested in developing. They basically then kind of put that out there and said, I'd like to work on this. And teachers were invited to say, yeah, you can come to my lesson. I think I'm quite good at that, or I think it works pretty well for me. And so again, this is the observer is the learner, if you like, rather than the observer as the expert, which I think is an important thing. So they're invited to the teacher's lesson, who and that teacher felt that they could offer something in this area. Before the observation, teachers sat together to discuss the observation and actually to determine whether the observer could co-teach or be part of the lesson, which was also an interesting thing. It wasn't something that Pip had imagined would happen, but this is what the teachers came up with. They thought that might work, that teachers would actually be able to co-teach the lesson, but whilst kind of observing at the same time. The observer attended the lesson for an hour and filled in a peer support activity form. This is something that they developed, the teachers developed themselves as part of this process. This was a form that they filled in to help them kind of like to make sure that they were getting the best value from the observation. And after the lesson, on the same day, ideally, or the following day, but it has to be fairly soon after, it has to be pretty soon after the lesson, otherwise it becomes too far in the past for people to really remember the details. The teachers met for a follow-up feedback session, which was guided by these forms. And before this whole process had started, they'd got some training on giving and receiving feedback. So they all felt that process worked very, very well. Okay, so that was Pip's idea, if you like, and but really it was teacher driven, and it worked very, very well. I've been in touch since with him since he launched this, and the teachers launched it. There's still some things he's dealing with, and specifically to do with contractual time and people finding the time to do observations and making sure that in the Australian market, as with many of our markets, a lot of the teachers are part-timers, and they're being paid hourly. So, making sure that people are getting the pay that they need to be able to do this, so that it's not something that's, it's just for full-time teachers. It needs to be for everybody as much as possible. So he's still dealing with some things to do with this. One of the things that he, in order, because he did feel it was very important and he did feel it was a very useful activity, one of the things that he did, for example, was he volunteered to substitute anybody who wanted to observe someone who was teaching at the same time as them. So if they, I'd like to observe so and so at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, but I'm teaching at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Pip would do the substitution, which he felt was at least giving them the message that I think this is important and I take it seriously. Therefore, I'm going to substitute your lesson, which obviously also kept costs down, because if he wanted to have someone else come in and substitute, there would be a cost there. That may not always be practical, but anyway, that was the system he came up with. So anyway, it's a very interesting, and I talk about it at length in the 2 articles that I'm going to link to. So just to sort of wrap up and think for you, just to think about what you're going to take away from this. Is there anything that you would like to take away? Is there anything that you would like to develop in your staff room? I'll give you the chance to think about that. And if you like, start, add any questions in the chat room that you feel I haven't yet answered. There may have been questions that you've asked and I haven't got to because I haven't been able to necessarily take in everything that's gone in the chat window. So if there are any questions that you have which haven't yet been asked, please ask them there. And well, thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Andy. That was great. I've been making a note of some of the questions as they were coming up, but let's see what people pose for you now.
So Mark, you're thinking about to do this in the context where teachers are part-time. Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge, and professional development in general, it's not just peer observation here, professional development in general is a challenge for organisations where many of the teachers, or all the teachers in some cases, are part-time. And it is challenging, I think, to kind of come up with a system whereby you offer serious professional development opportunities for teachers who are not on full-time staff. But I think it's worth doing, and I think it is worth doing. And a lot of schools have 2 different hourly rates. I don't know if your schools have the same, where you have the hourly teaching rate, and then you have an hourly, what's called an admin rate, I think, which is slightly lower than the teaching rate, but it is an hourly rate. I mean, it's based on the principle that to do an hour of teaching takes more than an hour of your time. I mean, it takes an hour and a half, let's say, to do an hour of teaching, because you've got to plan, you've got to mark homework, etc., etc. So, the teaching rate is higher because actually it's more. You're not working for an hour when you do an hour's teaching. You're working for more than an hour. Whereas when you're doing something in the office, when you have an hourly rate, then that's for an hour of your time. But yeah, and I think that something like that might be necessary. Otherwise, I mean, you can sell it all you like, and you can persuade people that peer observation is a great idea and they should do it for their professional development. And as we know, there are some teachers who will do this voluntarily, completely unpaid, but there are other teachers who wouldn't, and for good reason. I don't, so I think that it's something that you have to come up with, and you have to try and budget for in some ways, and you have to work out what's the best way to do professional development for part-time staff within a reasonable budget. So that's a big challenge for organisations. Let me see. Narmin, let me go to Narmin's question. When suggested to pay teachers for observation. Yeah, I meant paying the observers, because the teachers who are being observed are already being paid, we assume, because they're teaching. I mean, that's their job, so they're being paid for that. It's the observation which is perceived as something extra. So I would say the observer needs to be paid, yes. Yeah, George, I would love to have a system for managers to observe each other. I think that would be a great idea. I'm not quite sure they would make that one work, but we can think about that one. You and I, we can come up with some plan for manager peer observation. Yeah, I think that's true, Mark, that, people need to feel valued and acknowledged. Teresa, yeah, two novice teachers can observe each other. I think that's is entirely possible. I mean, in fact, in CELTA courses and the like, you do observe your fellow trainees, don't you? I mean, that's my experience of these kind of pre-service training courses like CELTA, is that the observation is done by the trainer, who's the expert, plus all of your classmates, if you like, your co-participants in the course. So I think, yes, two novice teachers can observe each other and they can learn a lot from each other. And the novice teachers tend to be very enthusiastic about this kind of thing. So I think, it's a great experience. Would peer observation, hi Ali, would peer observation replace admin observation of teachers? I think in my ideal world, yes, but in some schools that's not possible. If you read the articles that I posted, I mean, particularly there's a longer article that was in the Spelt Journal, which I really have problems with the idea of admin observation, and I would like peer observation to replace it. But there are some benefits of admin observation, and I wouldn't like to ignore them and overlook them. But I certainly don't think that peer observation should be set aside in terms for admin observation, and either should be both, or there should be just peer observation. An article about the right way of giving post-observation feedback. That's a great question, and I have a couple of articles which are actually referenced on the articles that I've posted up, which talk about giving feedback, but they're not specifically to post-observation. If anybody has any articles like that, could they share them with Ina? Any articles about giving post-observation feedback, giving feedback to teachers? Oksana, yes, the slide, this whole talk will be available on the LAMSIG and also the IATEFL website for non-members, yes. At least for the upcoming, at least for the near future. But certainly, yes, it will be available on the LAMSIG site. And I will give the link through Twitter or through Facebook or whatever as soon as I've finalized the recording. I have to do some work after we finish the webinar so that the recording is there for you, but it will be there. You missed the article. I've put the articles back up again. If you click to those links, Giovanna, you'll find it at the top of that page. The top of that page where you go to, that link will get you the two articles that I wrote. Okay, let's see. Teresa, yeah, I mean, obviously, observation as part of a training course is common, and I don't have a problem with that. Sorry, that's my doorbell ringing on my phone at the same time. I apologize for the extraneous noise. Hi, Laxman, how are you doing? I think I covered the question of time consuming in the talk, which unfortunately you just missed. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, it's my daughter who keeps calling me on the phone, so I kind of feel I want to answer that. So if no other questions, I think I'm going to wrap up, if that's okay.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Andy, for a very interesting talk with a very stimulating conversation going on through the chat room as well. I think people have taken a lot of good ideas to go away and try out. So good luck to everyone with that.
Yeah, I think so.
Shall we leave it
Thanks
there
everyone.
then, Andy?
Thanks everyone for coming.
All right. Fabulous.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye.
everybody. Bye now.